In October 1978, the badly decomposed body of a woman was found face down in a ditch. Her face was so badly damaged that identification was impossible. The woman remained nameless for 3 decades. Then, in 2006, a fingerprint match identified her as a 23-year-old woman from California. Although strong suspects have emerged, nearly half a century later, no one has been charged in her death. Guys, before we get into today's case, we want to take a quick minute to tell you about Proton VPN, which we use religiously here at True Crime Unsolved.
Look, you don't have to be a criminal to want to cover your tracks. In today's world, your data is bought and sold, and you are tracked all across the internet by all kinds of shady characters. But that's where Proton VPN comes in. It stops all of that and keeps you anonymous. I use it in my personal life as well as here at True Crime Unsolved.
One of the cool things about Proton is that they actually have a high-speed VPN accelerator that boosts speed by 400%. While most VPNs can slow things down, Proton is actually speeding it up.
That's right. Speed is everything with a VPN. Anyone who's ever used one will know. And Proton is by far the best. It's extremely fast. You can stream movies, music, you can play games, download files, and all while doing it completely anonymously and with total security. It's kind of like the online trifecta.
Guys, this video is sponsored by Proton VPN. If you want to save 70%, just use the link that's in our bio. It's also in this video description. Just copy that and use that when you make your purchase, and you'll save 70%. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to True Crime Unsolved. I'm Myles Reiff. I'm here, as always, with my buddy Sean Cahill. This is the place where we tackle the stories that the TV networks won't touch. Unsolved homicides, missing persons cases, stories without an ending.
Hey, everybody. Hi, Myles. How you doing? So today's going to be a really, really intriguing episode. I mean, obviously, we always aim for that, but this one in particular has a lot of unique angles to it. This story actually came to us because somebody reached out on social media a while ago and had learned about our channel, and they had sort of an unsolved mystery in their own life that they have been looking into for, oh my God, decades at this point. And although they've gotten some answers and some really big answers, the core issue here is a murder mystery, and we still don't have the answer to that particular part of it. What's interesting about the story is it was a Jane Doe case for a long time. So there was a body found, and police did not know who this woman was for decades. Concurrently, this person had a daughter who grew up not knowing her mother, who was looking for her, wondering if she was alive and if they would ever reconnect. And of course, there's the bittersweet moment where this woman is identified. The daughter discovers who her mother actually is and that she's no longer alive. And not only is she no longer alive, but she's actually the victim of homicide, and one that is still unsolved. And so there's just a lot of pieces here. I think the way we're going to get into it is kind of taking it through the very beginning of the discovery of this person, the Jane Doe investigation, and then that will dovetail later into the more personal story and the interview that we're going to have coming up for you guys next week with this person who reached out. So without too much more preamble, Myles, why don't I kick it to you and let's get into this really intriguing tale.
Thanks, Sean. Well, our story really starts with the discovery of this body, right? So it's October 4th, 1978. It's in a county in Iowa called Lyon County. It's a very rural area. And basically, there was some work going on. A utility worker was actually laying cable, and he noticed something in a ditch along the roadside. When he got closer, what he discovered was a body. Now, this body was very badly decomposed. It was obvious that it was a young woman, but her remains were very badly decomposed, and the condition was rather disturbing. It was a disturbing scene. What we know of when the body was discovered is that the woman's body was face down. She was believed, after an examination, to have been there for several months, probably at least 3 months. She was nude from the waist up, and her pants and underwear were actually around one leg. So she was practically nude altogether, and her pants and her underwear, as I said, were wrapped around one leg. Now, what was really interesting is that there was a rope that was actually discovered nearby, and when investigators kind of started examining the crime scene and putting things together, they did note that they believed that the rope may have been used to drag the body to the ditch. Now, it gets a little gruesome at this point. I'm going to get a little detailed here, but basically the body's entire lower jaw was gone. It was just completely removed from her head. And most of her upper teeth had been destroyed. They had been knocked out. So if you think about it, this is the late 70s when the body's discovered. This is really before DNA is a thing. And at that point in time, the way that a lot of bodies were identified was through dental records. So I'm not saying that that's what happened here, but it was very suspect that the jaw had been, as I said, the lower jaw had been removed and all of the upper teeth basically had been knocked out. It was also a very remote location. It was a very rural area. All of this kind of put together led the investigators to believe that the body had been dumped. So we have, the remote location, the obvious violence that had taken place on the body, and that in addition, this discovery of this rope that was found nearby, all put together, investigators did believe that something had happened to this person and that the body had been intentionally dumped into this ditch. But the big question still remained, who was she and why was she dumped here?
Yeah, exactly. Well, the first place that they start, of course, is with an autopsy. And that's always a little tricky with a person whose remains are in this condition, right? One of the first questions when you find things like jawbones missing or scattered remains is, if this, individual has been here for several months, is it possible that this is the result of scavengers, right? Did animals maybe do this? And they conclude very quickly that no, they don't think so. This looks like a human being's work, notably because, her teeth were smashed. There's a rope nearby. Her clothing is kind of, like Miles said, pulled down around her and off of her in a way that just looks like she was attacked by a human being. So the trouble is trying to figure out who this person is. Her fingerprints are taken. The dental records aren't of much help because, like we said, the teeth were just shattered. There was really not much they could do there. And facial reconstruction, as far as, just trying to figure out what this person might have looked like, which was still possible in the 70s. They didn't have the computer modeling and everything that we have now, but that was something that was, attempted and it was just too difficult. I mean, it's really unfortunate that this is one of those cases where it was just so violent and so gruesome what happened to this person that they really couldn't put her back together again in a way that would have told them what she actually looked like beyond her ethnicity, her sex, and her rough age, right? Which looked like she was in her 20s, Caucasian, female. That's what they were able to find out. And what's even more bizarre is that the other angle you would work here in an investigation is to look for missing persons reports. Has anybody reported somebody missing that roughly matches what we know about this person? And strangely, there wasn't any. There was nothing that they could find. There was nobody really missing that matched this description. Nobody that they could put this body to, which is typically, the next step when you can't identify somebody. You start looking at the other end of the puzzle. Okay, we don't know who this is. Is anyone looking for someone? But there was nothing like that. So in order to try to put these two pieces together, right, this is somebody, right? Presumably somebody knows this person. None of us get through life without interacting with somebody. Even if we don't have a lot of friends or family, somebody knows us, a neighbor, your mailman, right? So they're wondering, if no one's reported her missing and we can't figure out who she is, maybe we need to just advertise a little bit. And they put out bulletins. There's news stories, there's press conferences, and there's a sort of a Jane Doe campaign launched. Like, do you know this person? Help us figure out who this is. But what's really incredible is that it still leads to nothing. A year goes by, and then 2, and then 5, and then 10, and then 28 years go by with this unfortunate woman laying as a Jane Doe. She actually becomes known as the Lyon County Jane Doe. It becomes an infamous cold case in this county in Iowa. Sort of just one of these haunting unsolved cases that unfortunately happen from time to time. And look, like we talk about on this channel, 50% of homicides go unsolved in the United States, and they often look like this. A lot of times it's a woman. A lot of times they come from, a poor background or a marginalized, part of society where people don't report each other missing, or maybe they don't have a lot of family or friends. They're living sort of on the margins, on the skids, and bad things happen to those people, and the people around them shrug and move on, right? It's really unfortunate, but it was looking like this would wind up being possibly forever one of those cases that never got solved until something really interesting happened. And Miles, maybe you could tell us what that was.
Yeah. So I think it's worth noting here that, as Sean kind of mentioned, we've covered a lot of cold cases on the show. Obviously, that that's our bread and butter, right? It's unsolved cases. So those are usually they're cold. I mean, sometimes something, is deemed closed, but, for family members will still think that it's an unsolved case. And if we agree with that, we'll cover it. But for the most part, what we're doing here is covering cold cases. Now, I don't think enough credit goes to cold case investigators, because oftentimes that's an assignment that someone who's newly in the the sort of plainclothes division, the detective division. It's kind of like a job that's given to someone who's either kind of on the side of retirement, heading towards retirement, or sometimes it's someone who's new. Usually the guys who are in the middle are, grabbing for those active cases and going out in the street and doing that investigation. Because, any of you guys who are familiar with people in law enforcement, that's what they like to do. That's where the charge is. That's where the juice is in that industry, right? So like sitting and going through old boxes of evidence and trying to match DNA samples and stuff like that, which is what it takes to go through old cold cases. It's not necessarily why you sign up to be, an investigator. So, I don't think enough credit goes to cold case investigators, because a lot of times they're toiling away late hours in the dark by themselves doing this sort of like non-glamorous work. And I'm setting that all up because basically what happened in this case is that in 2006, which is a good, 40 years after the discovery of this body, a cold case investigator actually matches the DNA that was taken from this Jane Doe with a fingerprint that was taken from an arrest card, the old school cardboard cards that, they take your prints on. And that was from an arrest for a prostitution charge that was in Los Angeles, California in the 1970s. So the name of this woman that was arrested, whose DNA matched our Jane Doe in Iowa, was Wilma June Nissen. Okay, so the corpse that we're talking about, the body that was found in that ditch, now has a name. It's a person. There's an identity that's connected to it, right? Wilma June. We know that this is now someone who had a family, someone who perhaps had children, all things to be discovered. So while that's going on, unbeknownst to the investigators, there's another story that's been going on for decades, which is that Wilma June actually had a daughter. So her daughter's name was Krissi, and unbeknownst to the investigators, Krissi had actually been on a mission to find her mother for decades. Krissi had been adopted at a very early age. She had actually never met her mom. She had heard some stories because the family that adopted her actually was familiar with her mother as well, but she had never really been told much about her mother. Krissi grew up in California with this adopted family, and she had spent a lot of time in her adult years trying to track down her mom. She had actually taken it on as a sort of mission in her life to try to find something within her own existence to try to identify certain things within herself by trying to find her mother. So what she did, and this is, again, she's doing this before the internet is what it is today. So Krissi's actually, going out, looking up old police records. She's talking to people that she met through the foster system and through the adoption process. She's interviewing people. She's going through people's, memorabilia. She's talking to cops. She's doing all this, kind of like, what Sean and I have to do. She's collecting information. She's going out and she's trying to find out who her mom was. And she did this for a really long time. And, as you guys will see, we actually sat down with Krissi, and we're gonna obviously post that interview up, probably next week. But she said that basically her hope was just to be able to sit down and have a conversation with her mom. She wasn't looking for anything. She wasn't a person who, thought maybe, she had, an inheritance that was coming to her and she could track down her mother. Maybe it would change the circumstances of her life or something like that. That wasn't the case at all. She was really just trying to connect. She was trying to find her mother, trying to sit down with her, have a cup of tea, have a conversation, and connect with her. And basically what happens is that a small newspaper publishes an article that this Jane Doe, that, as Sean had mentioned, in this small area in Iowa, it became kind of a famous case. So the Jane Doe is finally identified. So a news article is written. And as a result of that, a friend happens to read that article, puts it together because of the name, and calls Krissi and says, hey, I think they may have identified your mother. And turns out this was her mother. So what Krissi does is she submits her DNA. She gets in contact with the department in Iowa. She gets a DNA test done, and there's a match. So it turns out that Wilma June is indeed Krissi's mom. And this woman who's been trying to search for her mom for decades, just so she could sit down and have a conversation, it turns out that all this time, her mother has actually been lying dead, face down in a ditch.
It's really incredible when you think about it. I mean, there's all these years where the investigation has a human being's remains, but no name. And meanwhile, Krissi grows up with the name of her mother, but having no idea where she is. And then one day they're connected. I struggle to imagine how difficult and confusing this moment must have been for Krissi, because to go your entire life not knowing your mother and be looking for her and thinking these thoughts, like you said, are we going to, when I finally meet her, are we going to develop a relationship? Are we going to get coffee together? Are we going to, am I going to get to learn more about her past and my family? And then you finally discover where she is, and you learn she's actually been deceased pretty much your entire life. And not only that, she's an infamous cold case murder victim. So now you have solved one mystery as Krissi, and you're presented with an entirely new one. And so Krissi's an incredible person, as you guys will see in her interview, because this is not the end of the road for her. Even after this extremely long and grueling search to figure out who her mom was, she picks right up and dives into this new investigation, which is, what happened to my mom? Like, what was going on in her life that led to her being discovered in this ditch in such a horrible condition? And the truth is that Krissi discovers a lot of really unsettling things. Her mother's life, as it turns out, was really not a pleasant one. It's one of these things that it's just such a human tragedy. She's one of these people that at every turn almost in her existence, she was given a bad hand. You know what I mean? Once in a while, you meet these people in life, or you hear about them at least, where it's like every moment where it comes down to chance, something can go right for you or something can go wrong. It goes wrong for them again and again and again and again. Some people have it the other way, right? Some people, it's just like nothing but sunshine and rainbows, an unbroken street of green lights. And we all want to be that person. Most of us are somewhere in the middle. Unfortunately, Wilma had more the first case. So let's talk a little bit about what Krissi learned. And I want to make sure I do this in sort of a nutshell, because there's a lot of detail that I want her to tell you in her interview. And so I'm going to sort of hold back on some of it and give you the broad strokes just in the service of moving along for this episode. So basically, Wilma's childhood was filled with severe neglect. Her father was a raging alcoholic and a child abuser. They lived in a car. She was not sent to school. She often had to wander the streets of Los Angeles growing up, looking out for her younger sibling. Again, we're talking not about like an 18-year-old. We're talking about like a 5 or 6-year-old kid whose dad would be gone on a bender. They wouldn't know, where she was going to eat, what her next meal was going to be. So she would just be wandering around LA into businesses, liquor stores, bars, hoping somebody would give her some food. God knows what might have happened to her during those times. We actually don't know. It's possible that she was preyed upon. It's possible that people took advantage of that situation, or it's possible that everyone she met just felt terrible for this poor kid who might as well have been an orphan at that point. All we know is that she survived, right? She was a survivor, and she was born into a situation where she had to figure it out. Well, eventually the state gets wind of what's going on with this family, and she is removed from her father's custody. She is given to a foster family. Now, this is the only part of Wilma's life that we can really identify where things were even remotely okay for her. So she moves in with this foster family. It's an older couple, basically, that take her in, and they're really good people. They are exactly the kind of people you would want you to wind up with as a foster kid. They treat her well. They take her seriously. They respect her. They feed and clothe her and give her shelter, perhaps most importantly, which is something she wasn't even getting any of that. But then yet again, tragedy strikes, and the mother comes down with a really bad case of rheumatoid arthritis, which the Child Protective Services gets wind of that and believes that her condition is bad enough that she's no longer physically really capable of taking care of kids, right? So this is somebody who, in their view at the time, needs to focus on themselves more, and those kids are going to now be taken and put somewhere else. So just as poor Wilma June is starting to settle down, once again, the ground is ripped out from beneath her feet. And this kind of marks the end of any sort of happiness or stability in her life. What we know next, or I should say what Krissi was able to discover next, is that her mom seems to have gotten married to a guy when she was 17 or 18 years old. We don't know exactly, but right around that age. And this gentleman, and I use that word very lightly here, turned out not to be such a gentleman, because he very quickly pressed Wilma June into sex work. So this isn't the kind of young love, young marriage that you probably would want for yourself or somebody that you care about. This is more of an exploited situation where she is a child growing into a young lady who's wound up with a guy who's really not looking out for her best interest. And unfortunately, this is the moment I think that might be the biggest turn of all in Wilma's life, because once she is pressed into that sort of work, it only gets worse, and sort of like a vortex, it just sucks her down into it. Somewhere in this tumultuous part of her life, Wilma winds up having a couple of children, and they're not all with this original guy. They're with different people, and Krissi's father is one of them. He's not this man that originally got Wilma into sex work. He's somebody else. But in a cycle or a pattern, I guess, Wilma's children are taken from her by the Child Protective Services as well, just as she was taken from her own parents, and they are dispersed to various foster families. So Krissi had some time with her mother very early on, but she was extremely young when she was taken away, and she doesn't really have much memory of those times with her mom. So during this period of her life, Wilma winds up having 3 children with different men. One of those men is Krissi's father, who she would not know. And she is taken very quickly, along with the other children, by Child Protective Services and distributed to various foster families. So Wilma, although she has 3 kids, does not really get to be a mom. And all 3 of those children grow up not knowing her. This is very sad. This is just kind of the cycle repeating itself. This is someone who grew up in a terrible situation, being taken by the state from their parents, having the same thing happen to their own kids. You could write a whole essay on that. I'm sure there's a lot of sociological phenomenon intersecting in that moment, but it's worth just pausing and saying, what a tragedy, right? What a tragedy that echoes to this day, even though that's something that happened in the 1970s, right? There's still a person out there who we interviewed on our channel who's being affected by that and those decisions. So all we know here is basically what Krissi was able to put together from police reports and various, honestly, rumors, and tracking people down and asking them questions over the years, asking them to think all the way back to the 70s when they last maybe had seen her mom. And what we can figure out is that something happened in California that made Wilma feel like she needed to leave. There's a couple versions of it. Some say that she was being threatened by a guy. Others said that she just wanted to look for maybe a new opportunity somewhere else. But either way, she leaves. Krissi stays and will wind up growing up in Southern California. We'll talk more about that in her interview. But Myles, why don't you take us on the sort of difficult to follow trail of where Wilma may have gone from here?
Yeah. As Sean mentioned, a lot of the information that we have is down to the work that Krissi actually did. Krissi did the investigating. Krissi went out there. She actually put together a lot of sort of word of mouth stuff with police records, and cross-referenced and created a timeline and sort of a path that her mother likely followed across the United States. And, a lot of what we're talking about kind of follows that. So big up to Krissi for her help with this. But basically, once we get past where Sean just was, where Wilma leaves Los Angeles, we're sort of getting into these last few months of her life in 1978. And what we have been able to reconstruct through, as I said, a combination of Krissi's research and police records, we know that Wilma most likely left Los Angeles with a man that she met in LA and probably went to Atlanta from LA. From there, she made her way to Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And we know for a fact that she was working in Sioux Falls, South Dakota for an escort service, okay? This is the kind of place that provided girls for bachelor parties, for other social events. It's, back in the day, there's a business card and you call it and it's girls for parties or whatever. And obviously there was a little more than dancing going on with these girls that were working for the service. So it was an escort service. Now, Wilma was known to be working with 2 other women quite often, and they were working for the same service. And these 2 women went by names, and those names were Sugar and Peaches. And obviously, these are probably not their real names. These are their working names. But there were 2 women that were known as Sugar and Peaches that were known to be working for this escort service, and Wilma was doing jobs with them, basically. Now, the investigators who have looked into this case have been able to put together that Sugar and Peaches were probably robbing clients sometimes, and perhaps other escorts. So they were kind of preying on the clients, and they were also preying on their co-escorts. And we do know that they have been looked into as suspects in this case by the investigators who took the case over after Wilma was investigated. So we don't know for sure that Sugar and Peaches had anything to do with Wilma's death, but we do know that they were sort of known to be doing this behavior. We do know that they were known to be taking advantage of these clients. They were known to be robbing their fellow escorts. And we do know that Wilma had been working for them, right? So it does kind of align, and it's hard to ignore it. And I think it's something that needs to be mentioned.
Absolutely. So we're going to go over a couple theories, and maybe we can kind of ping pong them back and forth, Miles, because there's several of them, and I don't want to deliver like a whole monologue and bore everybody to death. Here's the thing. So when you're living sort of the lifestyle that Wilma was living, right? Everyone here has something to hide, right? And the interesting thing when you have a collection of people like that is they can often take advantage of one another, rob one another, exploit one another. And very few of them are willing to go to the police and say anything about it because they themselves are involved in something that they don't want looked at. You see this in drug dealing circles too a lot, right? Like drug dealers robbing each other, taking things from each other, and nobody calls the cops. They just deal with it within their own community. So that's part of the reason that makes this so difficult, right? To figure out what may have happened here, because everyone around Wilma was basically an exploiter, right? Or somebody who was at the very least potentially dangerous, some of them outright dangerous. So let's talk first about the first theory, which is what you were just saying, right? Sugar and Peaches. Well, we know that she was working around these two people. We know that they are suspected and heavily rumored to have been not just robbing people, but also attacking them violently. This is something that the investigators were able to kind of take a look at years after the fact. A lot of these were sort of unsolved, assaults and robberies, and it started to coalesce around these two characters, right? And so we have to wonder, does Wilma's proximity to them kind of solve this whole mystery? Like, did they try to take something from her and she said no and it got out of hand? It's possible that happened. If you think about the way that Wilma was found, right, just the sheer amount of violence that was done to her, the strange place where it looks like she was dumped, because it's never been really proven that that's where she was actually killed. The ditch by the side of the road looks a little bit more like someone moved her there after the fact to get rid of her. So you have to wonder, for two people, that would be certainly an easier job than it would be for one. The level of violence could also suggest multiple people, although it doesn't necessarily have to. But what goes against this? Well, we did hear that the last time Wilma worked a job, those two women were not there. So she was not around then the last time she was really seen, doing escort work. And then the other thing is there's no other evidence really linking them to it except for just sort of these circumstantial, suspicious proximity to Wilma. Other than that, there's been no physical evidence. Nobody's ever come forward and said that they saw them together or that they know for a fact that they tried to rob them. No one ever saw these women in possession of Wilma's belongings after she disappeared. So there's nothing else except for, wow, they knew each other. These people are violent and she winds up dead. It's hard not to make that connection. But there's other possibilities, right, Miles? Why don't you take us to another theory?
Yeah. Well, look, considering what Wilma was doing for a living, you can't discount the possibility that she was killed by a client, or perhaps she was killed in some sort of like private party situation where something got out of hand. Again, she's working for a service that's sending girls to a lot of bachelor parties, a lot of events. So she's ending up in these like potentially dangerous situations. And I think a lot of times when people are in this kind of work, there is the risk of violence, and oftentimes that happens. Sometimes it's on the level of like a beating, and sometimes it does escalate to murder. So let's break this down, right? What could have happened? So did Wilma, end up with a client, that was, or maybe she was at a party where she was, sort of being paid to be the entertainment, and she ended up getting assaulted. Were perhaps these other two women there and they witnessed something? Perhaps that's why they've been a focus, because maybe the police believe that they were witnesses. Maybe they believe that they're sitting on information. It's possible. We do know that she was working with these girls. We do know that sometimes they would do parties together, right? So, look, as I said, the work that Wilma was doing was constantly exposing her to the unknown. It was constantly exposing her to new people. There's only a certain amount of vetting that can be done when you're calling up an escort service and asking for someone to be sent over for, entertainment. And back in the 70s, probably no vetting was being done. Let's be honest. It's not the same as today where there's the internet and, you can more easily check into who someone is, even if they're a stranger. The other thing that has to be addressed is the state of Wilma's body when it was found. And I'm not talking about the physical damage, but I'm talking about her clothing. The fact that she didn't have a top on, she was naked from the waist up, and the fact that her pants and her underwear were on one leg, meaning, it looked like they had been kind of like taken down. That kind of, points towards possible sexual activity. It also could be set up to look like that. The other thing to think about is where her body was found, this remote location. If you're piecing this together as an investigator and you're thinking about the possibilities, could she have been thrown in the back of a private vehicle and driven out there and then dumped? That kind of does make sense, right? Something horrible happens. You want to cover it up. You're gonna transport the body. You're not gonna get rid of it near where it happened, right? The problems with this theory, the problems with the idea that it was like a client or something that happened at an event where she had been hired, is that no one has ever been identified. No one's ever been publicly connected. We know the service that she was working for. We know where she was working out of. And you would think that because the investigators have done a really good job of sort of like diving back in and retracing what she was doing for a living, retracing who she was working with, we've made these connections to her coworkers. You would think that if there was a particular event or client that she had been going to see, that perhaps someone would have at least been investigated and questioned. And as far as we can tell, nobody has. Nobody of that type has. But what we do know is that there has been a focus on these two women known as Sugar and Peaches. That suggests that the investigators are perhaps working on information that goes beyond this random client theory.
And that's not the only thing that could have happened. I mean, there are some more slightly remote possibilities, like one of them would be maybe one of her handlers, right? Or somebody who was facilitating this work for her. There's a word for that. I'm not going to use it because YouTube doesn't like certain words like that. But we all know what I mean, right? Somebody that facilitates women for clients, that person could have had a falling out with Wilma. Maybe something went bad at a job and Wilma wanted to leave. I mean, you could see a lot of scenarios where there'd be an argument and it could lead to this. I mean, we know that violent murders like this very often have a male culprit, right? I mean, I'm not stereotyping. I think that's statistically true. The more violent the murder, the more likely usually it is that a man did it than a woman, although not always, right? Like, you don't want to take that off the table. But you could see how maybe it would point in that direction, which also leads to maybe none of the above. This could have been a completely unknown attacker or person that got her at the wrong time. I mean, we're talking about the 70s, right? The height of the serial killer era in America, where people like Ted Bundy were roaming the countryside, randomly attacking women. So it could be that it was something like that. Although, again, I'm talking about much more remote possibilities now, especially because Wilma already had a troubled life with dangerous people around her. I tend not to lean towards the random serial killer theory. I think there's probably much more likely things closer to home, but it's possible. The thing is,
Although serial killers often do prey on people in this industry. I mean, even going back to the days of Jack the Ripper, it is a thing.
Well, that's a really
I tend to agree with you, though.
No, but you make a great point, and I think that the central idea there is that Wilma was vulnerable. She was working in an industry where women are notoriously hurt, brutalized, and even killed. In an industry where people don't like to talk to the cops about what happened. In an industry where if you disappear, everyone around you just kind of moves on, right? The people who hired you will find another woman, unfortunately, to use in that same capacity. The clients will probably never know, and everyone moves on. It's really sad, and I don't want to sound callous about it, but like, that's the tragedy of that kind of work, and especially at this time period, it leads to a lot of Jane Does. It's really, really horrible, but it's true. At least Wilma has been identified now, right? And now we really are down to this last part of the mystery, which is who did this to her. Clearly it was somebody. And that's the part that we're kind of hung up on, right? And it's the part that Krissi's continuing to push forward and work on. I know that there's been a lot of different changeovers of investigators over the decades in Lyon County. But where does it sit today, Miles? I mean, what's the latest here?
Case is still open. It's considered a cold case. It's still open. As far as we know, there is somebody assigned to the case. We don't know how hard it's being worked on at the moment. We know that Krissi is still actively advocating for, her mother and for, her killers to be brought to justice. I think that's the center of this story for me is that, It's that, you know, there's this woman who spent decades wondering who her mother was, hoping to just have a conversation with her. Now, nearly 50 years after her mother has died, she's trying to figure out who killed her mother. You know, it's changed from who is my mother and can I sit down and get to know her to I need to try to get some justice for my mother, even though I never knew her. And it's just an incredible story that, you know, Krissi is fighting so hard for this person who she barely ever knew, to be honest. For me, Krissi really is the center of this story. So as far as we know, the case does continue to be investigated. We're going to have a lot more detail coming up in our interview with Krissi. She's at the center of this. She's been the person that's been sort of advocating for her mother. She's been interfacing with all the various investigators over the years who have been looking into her mother's death. But look, the long and short of it is, as far as Wilma's case has come from being like a literal unidentified Jane Doe in 1978 to knowing all we know now, something still needs to be done to close it. Something needs to be discovered. Someone needs to come forward. And to be honest, we don't even know if everybody that's involved is even alive anymore, right? Are the persons of interest that would be, the people to talk to in this case, are they even still above ground? We don't know. Are there other people that are connected to Wilma who still remember meeting her, knowing what happened that night when she was murdered? Are they still alive? Have they been investigated yet? Have they been spoken to? And is there dormant forensic evidence that could be looked at that could help connect with the killer? In other words, the clothing that was still on her, the rope that was discovered, the techniques that were used in 1978 were very different. Obviously, you know, the fingerprints were finally matched years later, right? So perhaps there is some sort of testing that could go on with the other evidence that, you know, using today's technology that could perhaps connect with other databases that, you know, didn't exist back in the day, that maybe could clear this up, whether the person is alive or dead. Notwithstanding, perhaps at least there could be a name connected with Wilma June's murder.
I mean, look, stranger things have happened, right? They got the Golden State Killer, and that was, those crimes were in the 70s as well, around the same time. And they got that guy, you know, now an old retired, senior citizen, and dragged him out of his house, and he's in prison. To everyone thought that was one of the greatest unsolved cases of all time. And he had multiple victims, and they figured it out. It just took a little bit of technology catching up. And luckily in that case, it caught up while the culprit was still alive. And we all got to see the monster behind those crimes and watch him go off to prison, many years too late, I'm sure, but sometimes better late than never. Will that happen here? It's entirely conceivable. I mean, a lot of people from the 70s are here. It's not that long ago. So conceivably these women or these men or whoever knows what happened are still around, still know, what took place that night. And it's a matter of tracking them down and proving it. So we hope, obviously, that that's what happens here. I know Krissi hopes, and she's working hard to keep that hope alive.
So why don't you guys let us know what you think? What do you think might have happened to Wilma June? If anybody's familiar with this case, what do you think about as far as like Sugar and Peaches go, and what we've heard about them? And obviously, guys, stick around for next week because we are going to be dropping that interview with Krissi, and I think that's going to add a lot more information to some things that we've touched on in this video.
So thank you, guys. If you have thoughts on this or theories or questions, leave them all in the comments, and we'll get back to you on one of our Monday comment reaction videos. And as always, don't forget, we're also a podcast. If you enjoy this show, check us out on Spotify, Amazon, Apple Music, if you'd rather just hear us than listen to us. And if you do, we get it. And if you really, really like what we're doing, don't forget to like, subscribe, and also check out our membership, which goes towards supporting all the work that we're doing here, trying to bring these cases to the public and help these families out who are looking for your attention. I think that's it, right, Miles? We'll see you guys next week.
Absolutely. Thanks, everybody.